Now joining me on the Kirby on Sports podcast, it's my good friend Madison. She once was with the Breeze, the student newspaper at JMU, covered a lot of JMU athletics down there in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Since then, she just recently graduated. First and foremost, Madison, thanks for your time today and congratulations. It must have been a long trek to get to graduation, but you're finally done. How's everything going?
Well, first off, thanks so much. It definitely was a long trek. 4 years with a pandemic thrown in there kind of, throws you for a curveball, but I'm good. I've moved back home for about another 2 weeks, a little less than before I moved down to Raleigh for my summer internship with the News and Observer. But I'm just kind of enjoying my 2 weeks of quiet and just enjoying this whole newfound happiness of being graduated before I really get down into the real world as I've been told it's called. So
Absolutely. So, just starting this off, Madison, just sort of take us through what got you so invested into sports? Like, what sort of was like, I want to take this path down sports and working for the Breeze and stuff. What sort of sparked that passion of yours?
well, so it's really interesting because for the longest time, I had no interest in sports, like, at all. When I was really young, my dad had grown up a massive sports fan, massive DC sports fan specifically. He grew up in Manassas, so he's a fairly local kid to the DC area. Basically lived in Northern Virginia his entire life. And so he was a really big Caps fan. He was a really big Redskins fan, now Commanders. And so wasn't much of an NBA fan. So I didn't really become a basketball fan until I got to JMU. But I was really raised on just like Chris Cooley and Alex Ovechkin and, all of these other players, these major DC sports names. But I didn't really care for a really long time. It wasn't until about middle school that I started really liking sports. I was a competitive swimmer and a travel field hockey player from middle school all through high school as well. So once I kind of really got into sports as an athlete, I started really liking it. I started watching a lot of ice hockey with my dad. I'm now an absolute massive Caps fan. I have been for pretty much my entire life, or at least in some capacity. And so I started seeing broadcasters and kind of seeing these sports teams and these games show up in newspapers and things like that. And I was like, wait, this is so cool. What is this? And my dad would explain, this is a sports reporter. They go to games, they interview the players, they write stories about them, they talk about them on TV. Sometimes they'll even call the games and all of that. And so I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like I just was like, oh, that's a really interesting career to have. And then my senior year of high school, I had the opportunity to shadow John Walton from Sports Network for about 3 games in 2019, so the year after they won the Stanley Cup, just before their playoff run against the Carolina Hurricanes. And I got to see what it was like, kind of experience journalism as like from an inside perspective. I went and sat in on press conferences, watched them film pregame stuff, got to watch John Walton call a few games, got to see the production truck, things like that. And that was kind of the moment where it was like, okay, yes, this is it. This is what I want to do. And at that point, I already decided I was going to JMU for journalism. It just wasn't like dead set completely yet. Once I had done that experience, it was kind of a done deal. And so from there, I got involved with the Breeze. And honestly, I don't really think I ever looked back. I kind of just dove right into it and probably became one of the craziest people you've ever met with just how much I was surrounded by JMU athletics and doing interviews and writing print stories and staff reports and updating the website and designing the print editions eventually. But fast forward 4 years, I finished my time at the Breeze. I've covered every inch of JMU athletics, I'm pretty sure at this point. And then some also, I'll say, and then some as well. And now we're here.
Yeah, like you said, you've covered every inch of it. You mentioned you played some field hockey, and I want to start here. You recently had the opportunity to call field hockey on ESPN Plus. Sort of take us through what that was like playing it and then broadcasting? What perspective that did that give you?
Well, so it's interesting because when I had graduated high school, I went and helped out as kind of just like a extra person almost with some of the green days, as we called them, for the following season for my varsity field hockey team. I was very close with my high school coach, still am to this day. And I would just send her a text, be like, "Hey, I have nothing to do. Can I come crash practice?" And she was like, "Yeah, sure, come on over." And I would go and I'd help out some of the younger players that were either new to the sport or was just kind of learning or struggling with some element of the game. So I had this like coaching perspective for a while. And I really wanted to kind of do more. My dad had pushed me to really look at what it would be like to call a game as a color commentator. And so I ran into Kurt Dudley, who you and I are both very close with.
Absolutely.
I just kind of approached him one day at a volleyball game and was like, "Hey, I want to do color commentary. I have played field hockey for 8 years. I'm a huge fan of the sport. I am more than happy to talk field hockey with you." And at that time, he was actually looking for a new color commentator for the 2021-22 season, and so that was still on Flow Sports at the time. So that was my first crack at it, was calling, I think about 6 or 7 games, mixed with Kurt Dudley and then also Corey Spector as well. I did, I think, about 3 and 3 with each. And then once JMU made the move to the Sun Belt, everything switched over to ESPN Plus, and I decided to stick with calling field hockey because I absolutely loved it. I loved working with Kurt, and he pushed me to take the next step and really kind of get into a little bit more in-depth with the prep work. So I started doing some interviews. I was going to a lot more practices, kind of really taking on this really observant but also analytical role. And so that allowed me to kind of really expand my knowledge a little bit more. Having played the game for so long, I knew the rules pretty well. I could talk about the rules, I could explain the rules. It was more so of not just looking and explaining the rules of field hockey, but applying them to how JMU and how whoever they were playing were applying those rules or using different techniques to kind of match each other during a game. And it was really fun. Like, it was something that you don't always get to go that in depth analytically when you're writing sometimes, just because it can get a little confusing without that visual component. So having the visual component and being able to explain it was something I had never done before, and it was such a blast. I absolutely loved that opportunity. It was super cool. I can say that I was a color commentator and an analyst for ESPN for the rest of my life now, which is, kind of a cool little thing to say. And I wasn't even 21 when I did that. So it was a really cool experience. And I absolutely loved it. And I can't thank Kurt enough for that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned, JMU, the move to the Sun Belt, let's say maybe like 4 or 5 years ago to today, the Sun Belt switch, obviously JMU is rapidly growing based on my sole opinion. That could be different in your mind, Madison, but just the switch to the Sun Belt, it just seems like a great move all around for JMU athletics.
Yeah, I would say so as well. It was interesting because the summer leading up to that move, conversations really started sparking again, especially because JMU softball had just done their run in the Women's College World Series and all of this kind of stuff. And I actually remember having a conversation with a few people and being like, "Yeah, I don't like. I think it's going to happen soon, but I didn't expect it to happen while I was a student." And this was before like the whole Texas Oklahoma SEC thing kind of came into play. Once that happened, then I was like, okay, ripple effects might change things here. And I didn't know to what extent. I knew the last time there was this massive NCAA realignment, it took years before we ended up in the conference alignment that we had prior to June 2021. And so I expected that the ripple effect would eventually hit JMU. I didn't expect it to hit in November of that same year, but it did. I think it was a great move. I remember sitting in the Breeze office with my co-editor at the time, Savannah Rieger, not paying attention to the work that we were supposed to be doing because I think it was Pete Thamel from ESPN was the one that tweeted out that the Sun Belt was expressing interest in JMU. I think it was him, if I remember correctly. And I remember being like, okay, let's take a look at this. And we pulled up the website to the Sun Belt and to Conference USA, and we were comparing it. And our editor in chief was like, "You guys need to be working on this paper." And we're like, "Hold on, we need to figure this out first." And we sat at our desk for like a good hour, not working on the paper or editing stories, but just trying to understand what the Sun Belt was. And I think the two of us came to a consensus pretty early on that, this looked like a conference that actually did make sense, especially once we looked at the individual schools and we understood the history behind it. And then once ODU started expressing interest in the Sun Belt and Marshall did, that was when we really started noticing, like, okay, this could be a conference that JMU could have a lot of fun with. So eventually it just kind of became a no-brainer in a sense. Like, if JMU's going to do it, it's going to be in the Sun Belt. And so, I mean, it felt like it happened so quickly. I still think it happened really quickly, but I still think it was absolutely the right move. And so, yeah, fans might have had to wait a lot longer than they originally might have thought, but once things really started getting moving, it made a lot of sense, despite the fact that it felt like it happened in about 2 seconds.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. I just could not imagine how much paperwork and other
Oh,
logistical stuff goes into switching a conference. Like, yeah, it just blows my mind. But doing it so quickly, I'm just like you said. But anyways, let's move on. Talking about JMU baseball first. They finished the regular season 30-23, if my notes serve me correctly. They are moving on to the Sun Belt tournament coming up. First and foremost, Madison, just your thoughts on JMU in the regular season. Had a lot of very close games. I know a couple players as well. Fenwick Trimble, one of them, a player I actually know pretty well, hit a couple deep bombs in the game, but a couple hard hitters in general and some of their pitching. But just overall, to talk about the regular season for JMU baseball and what you saw.
I think it was a season that JMU fans can call a success, actually. I know JMU is in the single elimination side of the bracket for the Sun Belt tournament, but this is the second winning season under head coach Marlon Eichenberry. So that's already a big deal in and of itself. They did very well in a very competitive Sun Belt conference. I mean, that was one of the things that I immediately took notice when we were first looking at the Sun Belt, was that baseball is a real thing in this conference. It's not an easy conference, and that was something that was very clear from the get-go. And when I talked to all of the players, they were all really excited about it. They were like, yeah, this will be cool. And they talked about how excited they were to see the stadiums. I remember every single player that I talked to was ecstatic to go check out Southern Miss's stadium. Every single one of them. It was something they all mentioned. I was like, what stadium are you most excited to see? Southern Miss. Like, it was without hesitation. And so I really think that they took advantage of the fact that they were kind of the new kid on the block, per se, and just went and had fun with it. They played pretty well. I thought it took a little while for their bullpen and their pitching to kind of really get under them and really get a little bit more consistent. But I think once Eichenberry found a rotation that worked, I think it started boding for them very well. I think that there's a lot of younger players too that have a ton of potential on top of those seniors that have played well and have proven that they can play well. You mentioned Fenwick Trimble. He had a really strong season, I thought. I thought Jason Schiavone came out, had a really, really strong season. He talked about how he kind of was fixing an injury going into the season. But, I mean, once he was able to, he was consistent. He was very consistent behind the plate. He was getting some serious quality at bats, which I was really happy to see. Was actually also able to hit a few home runs, including a walk-off grand slam against Georgia State, I believe it was, which was super cool to see. And then Mike Mancini is a true freshman this year. He's been playing second base next to Mason Dunaway, who's been playing shortstop. And Mike has shown a lot of potential. He's got a really strong eye, he's a very high IQ baseball player, has blended very well in the lineup. He was batting a little further down in the lineup to start the year. He's now batting fourth in the lineup. So he's worked his way up. They've had him there since about, I want to say, the Louisiana series. So about mid to late April, and they've just kind of stuck him there since. No, it was probably a little bit earlier than that, probably closer to the start of April. But he's played very well there. He's blended really nicely with the team. And that's a player that Eichenberry has been talking about since preseason. He's said, Mike Mancini's a kid that has a lot of potential with him. He actually won a Little League World Series championship, which is kind of cool. Like, I don't feel like not every college player can say that. So it's kind of cool to be able to talk to him about that too. So I think overall, you're looking at a pretty solid team with a really nice foundation to build off of, whether that is in this year's Sun Belt tournament or turning around for next season as well.
What do you think going into the tournament? Any predictions? Do you think JMU can make it pretty deep?
Well, I think it's interesting because they're facing off against ODU. So the royal rivalry has not ended. There's still one more game apparently. Even though we thought that the regular season was going to be the end of it, there's still one more game because they do count postseason play for that as well. Um, I think if JMU can get past ODU, I think that kind of makes things a little bit more interesting. The way the rest of the bracket will shake out is still kind of a little bit in limbo just because of the single elimination rounds. I think if JMU can avoid Southern Miss or Arkansas State, they would be in a pretty good position. Um, I don't necessarily know if I completely see them, going all the way. However, I think the fact that they're able to potentially put themselves into the double elimination round is a huge step for this program, especially after so much that they have dealt with over the last 3 years. I mean, you have to remember this is the first time that I've seen this team in a conference tournament because my freshman year you had the pandemic. My sophomore year they didn't make the conference tournament, and then this past year they were banned by the CIA. So this is the first year that I actually get to see this team compete in a conference tournament. So I'm kind of going off of what I've seen from this year, without any really knowledge on how they've done in previous conference tournaments prior to my time at JMU.
Absolutely. So from baseball, moving on to softball, finishing their season with a record of 28-19. I didn't really get a chance to watch much of JMU softball, to be honest. I tried getting out to a game because I know that whole baseball and softball complex get together. I know they're trying to grow that more. A second deck already added to softball, but I know you covered some softball as well. Just talk about the softball season for JMU and what you saw.
I think it's pretty similar to what we said with baseball. I think that they've laid a pretty strong foundation. I think it was a little difficult to have some players like Alyssa Humphrey end the season with an injury and not be able to really kind of compete to the full potential that they had. But I think KK Mathis is a star on the rise for JMU. I really do believe she's got a ton of potential. So she's somebody I'm really interested to see. And we've now hit the point where JMU fans are going to start to see those Women's College World Series recruits start to come in. You're going to start to see players that took notice of that when they were juniors and seniors in high school or sophomores in high school, and have an interest in it. I think a lot of people are expecting them to make it further into the Sun Belt Conference than they did. But I think for a first year, I thought they played pretty strong. They were a little up and down at times in conference play, but for the team that they were after dealing with everything that happened last year, on top of being in a new conference where you're having to learn new opponents and you're developing new rivalries and things like that, I think there's a strong start. But I think that in a sense, there are some JMU fans that are a little disappointed that they're not further into the tournament that they would have liked the Dukes to have been. But I think that's where you kind of start looking at the fact that you do have those recruits that are going to start coming in pretty soon. And hopefully that will also make a pretty strong impact on this program as well.
Here's a loaded question. What do you like covering better, baseball or softball for ESPN Plus?
I really, really like doing baseball. I've loved covering the JMU softball team. I think they're tons of fun. I just didn't do enough of it to be able to compare it, if that makes sense.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, so I've mostly always done baseball through the Breeze and with ESPN Plus. And that was just because I've grown up watching more baseball. Um, like I said, I'm a DC sports fan, so I grew up a Nats fan. So my first year in college was them winning the World Series. So that kind of starts my baseball love on a pretty high note. Um, but I definitely kind of really liked college baseball. I got really into college baseball the last 2 years, just in the NCAA world of it. I find it so much fun, especially once we get into regionals and super regionals. So I'm interested to see what's going to happen. This coming regionals is going to be really interesting in my personal opinion. I'm really excited to actually see what Coastal Carolina ends up doing. They were number 7 in this week's rankings, if I remember correctly when I looked this morning. Um, so they put themselves in a really nice position if they don't win the tournament to end up as an at-large. Whether they still end up hosting or not, I'm not 100% confident, but I have a feeling they likely could. Um, Personally, I think they should host a regional, but I guess time will tell. We'll find out in about 2 weeks. Um, but I definitely would have to say if I have to pick between the 2, I would probably say baseball just because I got to do it a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely. But like I said before, both those complexes are nice. It must have been an amazing place to cover a ball game for sure.
Oh my gosh, that softball press box is absolutely gorgeous. They did a
I bet.
really, really nice job renovating that stadium. The second that upper deck is really cool. I know a ton of people that loved sitting right behind home plate that only sit up top now because they love that, like, a little bit more of an aerial style view. So I'm intrigued to see what they do with the rest of Memorial, including, like, the practice facilities and things like that inside Memorial Hall, to kind of beef it up as well, because I know that's something that Jeff Bourne has talked about wanting to do, in the near future.
Last but not least, we have to say congratulations because recently you posted an article in the Washington Post.
Oh my gosh.
How about
Yes.
that? Covering lacrosse, but you were doing it for the Post, so obviously Maryland.
Mhm.
Not but you were in Harrisonburg for it. What was
Yes.
that like? If
It was
JMU ended up winning by a point, but what was that like covering it?
it was surreal. I got a phone call from the sports editor, on my graduation day, like, the morning of graduation. I had the way that it kinda had shaken out, I had applied for something within the Washington Post completely separate, hadn't really told anybody about it. So I got a phone call from Chris Brooks, who is the JMU football SID, who used to do a bunch of stuff with lacrosse and was helping out during the NCAA tournament run. And he called me, he was like, "Hey, have you heard anything from the Washington Post?" So the first thing that came to my mind was, "Wait, how did you find out I applied for something?" Um, and I'm, like, leaving my final because I had a final that morning, and I was like, "No." And so he had said, "Somebody is supposed to be reaching out to you from my understanding." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And I was sitting here and I was like, "I'm gonna try not to get my hopes up." And so I go back to the Harrison Hall studio, where my final was, to go and do, like, one last little thing because it was for a broadcast that we were putting on. And I had my phone on do not disturb, and there's absolutely no cell service in that studio. So, like, even if I wanted to try and take a phone call, I couldn't. And so everything wraps up. I'm like, okay, time to go, like, clear my head, get ready for graduation. My mom and my sisters are gonna be here in like 45 minutes. And I look down at my phone and there's a voicemail. And I was like, wait a second. So I listen to the voicemail. I'm not even like outside of Harrison Hall before I call him back. And so the collegiate sports editor had reached out to me and was like, "Hey, we're looking for somebody to cover this game. Um, would you be interested?" They only wanted me to do the second round. They had Shane Metlin from the DNR do the first round for Maryland, and so I was like, "Yes, absolutely. Are you kidding?" But after that, I just kind of like kept it quiet. Like I told my mom and I told like a couple other people, but I was like, I'm not gonna really tell anybody else because it was only if Maryland played in the second round. I wasn't covering JMU, I was only covering Maryland. So the fact that it was JMU versus Maryland just kind of made it things a little bit more interesting. Um, but yeah, so like once Maryland won, I was able to kind of tell people and was like, "Hey, guess what I get to do tomorrow?" And so yeah, it was super cool. And then I think the best part was I didn't expect to kind of end up in print just because Maryland had lost. I wasn't sure if that meant that they were going to put it in just like online, if they were just going to have like a little snippet or anything. So the next morning I open up and not only is my entire story in there, but it's like with like you open up the sports page and it's like the first one that you open up to and it's on the
Wow.
top of the page and I am over the moon. I grew up reading the Washington Post. Like I have the Washington Post delivered to my house every single morning. So, I mean, like, behind my wall is framed copies of the World Series championship and the Stanley Cup championship that my dad purchased specifically because I told him I wanted a copy of these
Yeah,
newspapers.
I'm looking at my two right over there.
Exactly. So
But
it's just
I
like,
framed it. So what happened? I got all the because they print. I don't know. There's memorabilia sort of things or something that like commemorate their championship in the post, and I just had it laying around. I'm like, okay, it's time to frame this, and I finally got two frames that worked. It took me about an hour, and they're just hanging up in my studio. And it's just my memory that two DC sports teams won a championship. So
exactly. And so it's just like when I've grown up, like the Washington Post was my example of what a newspaper looks like. Not necessarily how a newsroom operated, just because I hadn't seen what that was, but just kind of like this is what a newspaper is. And then once I got into SMAD and I started doing classes for JMU, I started realizing like learning a little bit more about the history and the importance. And so when you go from like a 6-year-old kid who would run down the driveway every morning to pick up a copy of the newspaper and bring it inside to seeing your name in that copy of a newspaper. I mean, it was such a cool moment. It was such a cool opportunity too. I had so many people that were texting me and that were sending me pictures of them holding up the newspaper with my name on it. So it was super cool to see, and I know that it was a moment that my dad would have been super proud of, which kind of definitely makes it a lot sweeter too, just because he was one of my biggest cheerleaders all throughout college. So to be able to have that opportunity and to know like, yeah, he's jumping up and down for me right now, was also making it really sweet.
wait, nobody texted asking for an autographed copy for crying out loud?
I have had people do that. I will say, like a couple of my dad's like coworkers have been like, "I'll pick up a copy of a newspaper if you sign it." Nobody did it for that one though. That was actually for a Richmond Times story that I had written. Um, Back in during football season, I had somebody pick up a copy of the newspaper for me, and they're like, "I'll give it to you only if you sign mine," as like a joke. But I can say I have had somebody jokingly ask me that, but no, nobody asked to sign the Washington Post story. I'm kind of okay with that. I'm still like I still very much in my college student mentality. I don't necessarily know how I would feel about having that one happen quite yet. Maybe one day it would be cool to say that happened, but I think I'm a little too young to be able to say that that would be like the next step for me.
Well, you're graduated and you're home now for another 2 weeks, so hopefully you'll find time in there to get that article framed and hung up, right?
Yes, yes, that's the plan. I have a couple newspapers that I need to get framed of mine. I have my story that just recently won a Virginia Press Association award. I want to get that one framed. And then I have a story from my internship last summer at the Buffalo News that I have not framed yet, but I have been meaning to frame just because I have not purchased the frame yet. And so that story ran A1, so that was on the cover of the
Wow.
newspaper, and ran like a day or two after my internship ended. And so I've been meaning to get it framed. I had it shipped to my house because I had already left Buffalo when the story ran. So I didn't even get the newspaper until like my birthday. But I haven't purchased a frame yet. So I've got like 3 or 4 stories that I need to frame. And so yeah, I have a stack of newspapers of every copy of The Breeze that my name has appeared in. Those are not going in that stack. That stack is reserved for a different project that I'm trying to finish.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Before we wrap things up here, Madison, you mentioned your internship coming in about 2 weeks down in North Carolina. Just touch on what you'll be doing down there in North Carolina.
So I'll be working for the News and Observer, which is the city of Raleigh's newspaper. I'll be working on their sports desk and hopefully also doing some stuff with the Charlotte Observer since that's only about 2.5 hours down the road from there. Um, my fingers are crossed. I've started to become a little bit of a Carolina Hurricanes fan for the sole reason of the fact that I have been told if the Canes make it to the Stanley Cup Finals, I would be able to help out with some coverage in some capacity. I don't know what the some capacity means. I jokingly said, I was like, listen, you can tell me to write a story about some random stranger on the street, and I will do it if it means that I get to do some NHL Stanley Cup Finals coverage. Um, so I've had to like become a little bit of a Canes fan just because, one, I need to learn the team a little bit, and also in the sense of I would love that opportunity. I will say though, I was not fully awake for that 4 overtime game 1 loss. I fell
Yep.
asleep, and that was sad. I woke up around 1:30 and then actually forced myself to stay up to watch the end of the game. And then as soon as the Panthers scored the goal, I turned the TV off and was like, okay, cool, time to go to bed. So hopefully there will be an Eastern Conference Finals game where they do not go into overtime. And so, but I'll be doing a little bit of everything. Hopefully I'll get some opportunities to do some more professional sports. I would love to do some NHL draft coverage if given the opportunity. But yeah, I mean, I'm hoping to kind of get a hodgepodge of different stories, maybe even some stadium operations or some non-true like game features or player features, and kind of expand into some more enterprise work as well. But I'm really excited about it. It'll be a really cool summer. I've never been to Raleigh. I've only visited Charlotte once, about a month and a half ago. I went for a conference, so very new cities to me, but I am very excited. I like being able to go to new places and do all that kind of stuff. So it should be a good summer.
That is awesome indeed. Madison, we appreciate your time. Wishing you nothing but the best. And it's always a pleasure chopping it up with you. Maybe once you get settled down there, maybe we'll be talking about the Hurricanes or something on this podcast here soon.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and hopefully things will work out where I get that opportunity. But it's NHL playoff hockey. You never know what can happen at this rate.
You never know. You never know indeed. Yes, but Madison, thank you again. Wishing you all the best, and thanks for joining us here on the Kirby on Sports podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.